Awesome. Well then, hi everyone, and thanks for joining us this evening or afternoon, depending on where you are from. I'm Kai. I work for the Austrian Economics Center, as well as the Friedrich August von Hayek Institute, which are both classical liberal think tanks based in Vienna, Austria. And it's a great pleasure to moderate today's webinar on coronavirus lockdowns, which I think is probably the hot button issue today. I mean, earlier this year, we've had already these kinds of lockdowns, these severe restrictions to our public, our economic, our social lives. And now we are in a similar situation yet again, as most European countries in the last 2 to 3 weeks have closed down everything once more, from the UK, Spain, France, Italy, Germany, Austria, to Belgium and all the others. Basically, life has stopped again. At least at the moment, depending on which country, but in most countries that's the case. Everything is closed, from restaurants, cinemas, hotels, and pretty much everything. People are, in many countries, not allowed to leave their houses except for appropriate reasons. Meeting other people has become a great challenge, and traveling has become, in many regards, an impossibility without prior testing or quarantine. The assumption is that none of this will stop until the virus is fully defeated, whenever that will be. Today, we will discuss these kinds of measures, and I'm happy to have the special guest with us, Jeffrey Tucker. Jeffrey is the editorial director of the American Institute for Economic Research. He is the author of many thousands of articles. I think I see like every day a new article by Jeffrey. He has written 9 books, which have been published in 5 languages. The latest is his book called Liberty or Lockdown, which I think is quite appropriate, obviously, for today's topic. Thanks, Jeffrey, for joining us.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks so much for having me. Yeah, and I suppose you want me to give 15, 20 minutes and then open it up. Is that the idea?
Exactly. So, I mean, already for the audience now, if you have any questions for Jeffrey, then please don't be shy. And if you're on Zoom, then type it in the Q&A box down below. And if you are watching it on Facebook, then simply write a comment, and my colleague backstage will, I hope, forward me the question then. And in that sense, Jeffrey, the floor is yours on lockdowns, on the Great Barrington Declaration, which the AIER has published, and what do you think about the current approach of governments around the world?
Okay, thank you. My thesis is that that none of what's happening in the world today is necessary. I don't believe it will mitigate the disease, and it's going to cause immense social, cultural, economic harm, and that politically we are in dire straits, that regimes have been so disrupted all over the world for reasons that are unclear. My own thesis, it's the thesis of my book, and it's the one I've been working on since January. I wrote my first article on this topic on January 27th, pleading with governments not to use their presumed quarantine power. My thesis is that all of this results not so much from conspiracy, but from intellectual error. And people are suspicious of that. They think, oh, this is all because people have made a mistake. It's like, yeah, I think this is what it's really behind it. I think if you doubt that, you don't understand the power of ideas. But one bad idea can lead to the unraveling of civilization. And in the case of these lockdowns, we have a lot of bad ideas. It's a little bit of a shock to us, I think. When I say us, I mean basically Austrians, maybe classical liberals, but also when I say us, I mean basically everything and everybody. We didn't have any idea, most of us didn't have any idea that governments were capable of doing that. We didn't know they had the power, much less the will, to do what they've done to us, which is fundamentally injure everything we've called human rights for the last 500 years and reverse the progress of civilization over the last 1,000 years towards the rule of law and certain presumed equality of freedom. And we're introducing a new caste system and a new feudalism, all for reasons that I don't think are justified. And we're very close to discovering this. I think sometime next year, there's going to be a real reckoning to figure out how the hell this happened. So the purpose of my remarks today is just going to map out a little bit of what I see is the failings, so that we can get a little bit of a grip on what we're dealing with. Uh, we also have to recognize that all of us, whether economists or journalists or just run of the day, sort of liberals, people who care about future progress and freedom, that sort of thing, have been completely blindsided to discover this other regime that's existed out there, apparently in the shadows for a long time. We didn't know that epidemiologists had such plans for our lives. We didn't believe that such arrogance could ever exist in the world. I mean, it used to exist among the economists when they used to model macroeconomics and think that they could turn a dial here and turn a dial there. Oh, let's make money supply go up and we'll make unemployment go down. Or if the aggregate demand falls because of the recession, we can just boost government spending and that will cause the recession to go away. And so economists have been dealing with sort of naive modeling now for better part of 90 years probably, and it's mostly fallen apart. It's fallen apart for the last, say, 30 or 40 years. But epidemiology is actually in a very primitive state, doing all the same stupid things that economists used to do that led to such calamities, and that basically stopped doing. All the epidemiologists have picked up on it. So I want to talk about some of those things. This is why there's a bit of a parallel between the Hayekian project and the anti-lockdown movement. It's very similar. Like Hayek's critique of central planning pertains also to the epidemiological models too, in ways I hope to explain. But let me just read to you really quickly a document that came out from the apparently incoming Biden administration. All right, so to understand something about American politics, and we'll get to this a little bit later, the relationship of lockdowns and politics, but Trump was the first mover on the lockdown. So February 8th, he locked down flights from China, which is unprecedented. And he was been anxious to drive a wedge between the US and China for a very long time, and I think very unnecessarily. So the tariffs came first. And so first thing he wanted to do was call it the Wuhan virus and block Chinese flights into America. And I guess nobody was surprised by that, but actually, I mean, it's an outrageous attack on free trade and free movement of people. So that was the first problem. On March 8th, the Austin mayor banned the South by Southwest conference in Austin, Texas, which would normally attract something like 250,000 people. So just in the stroke of a pen, got rid of a million different contracts involving housing, hotels, and plane travel. And it's like just an egregious, fundamentally un-American action. 4 days later, Trump went on national television on his own decision, decided to block all flights from Europe and said everybody has to come back by Monday. A dictatorial action that is not permitted under the U.S. Constitution. There's never been no power like that has been ever exercised in American history by any American president. It was an egregious and appalling thing. The next day, his own CDC, with the White House imprimatur, released what amounts to a Stalinist plan for school lockdowns and business shutdowns and that sort of thing. It was classified. The first, as far as I know, public release of this document came out from the American Institute for Economic Research. You can see it on our website. We have it printed there. So if you think the Trump administration has always represented, laissez-faire, open it up kind of position, that's completely wrong. They were the first movers on lockdowns. And so as the campaign progressed, however, Trump realized that he did not get elected president to destroy American life. That's a slightly regrettable thing to have done. And he began to kind of reverse his position, driving then his opponent, Biden, into the opposite corner of being in favor of the very thing that Trump did, while opposing what Trump now supported. So it's a little complicated for foreign observers to understand how it is the Democrats became the lockdown party, even though the Republicans began as the lockdown party, and how the Republicans are the open it up party, even though they began as the lockdown party. So I just want to read you the statement from the incoming Biden administration. Social distancing is not a light switch. It is a dial. President-elect Biden will direct the CDC to provide specific evidence-based guidance for how to turn the dial up and down relative to the level of risk and degree of viral spread in a community, including when to open or close certain businesses, bars, restaurants, or other spaces, when to open or close schools, and what steps they need to make to make classrooms and facilities safe, appropriate restrictions on size of gatherings, and when to issue stay-at-home restrictions. Right? So this is what the new Constitution for America, government on its own, Biden and with massive power, nuclear weapons, in consultation with a bunch of scientific cranks, will decide when and to what extent we can exercise our rights, whether your business can open or close, whether they can force you back into your home under quarantine, how many people can gather, where we can go to the movies, go to Broadway, go to sports shows or anything. So this overrides every bit of Western constitutional traditions, and obviously represents a profound attack on human rights and human freedom, and it cannot be allowed to stand. And how any government could just willy-nilly issue such an order cries out for explanation. Since my whole life has been dedicated to somehow securing more freedom for people, economic and otherwise. Now you have governments basically assuming unto themselves totalitarian powers over human rights, not just in the United States, but apparently all over the world. So we're in an epic crisis right now. Let us not doubt it. This is not a temporary situation. This is not something that people really should be debating. Actually, if you're a civilized person, you should immediately see what's wrong with this. So let me go into a little bit of the history of how this whole thing came about. The problem really began 20 years ago. And it began when a bunch of computer modelers got involved in the business of disease mitigation. How and why they did is really unclear. Sometimes I wonder if it all has something to do with the confusion over language. 20 years ago, computers had a real problem with viruses, and and computers would be working very well, and then a pathogen would suddenly show up in email and eat the hard drive up and burrow itself into the networks and make the dreams of computers sort of null and void. So a major problem that they had to deal with in the computer industry 20 years ago and over the subsequent 10 years was dealing with the presence of pathogens in computer networks. And so I think, I can't prove this, but, how is it that Bill Gates got so interested in this topic? This might have something to do with it. And what's interesting when you watch his talks on TED Talks on viruses, he talks about them exactly this way, as exogenous to the system that he's trying to build. Everything's going fine. Society's going along fine, and suddenly a foreign pathogen enters into it and threatens the very functioning of the whole of society. And the only way we can deal with this is to block it, eradicate it, suppress it, make it go away, just as he did in the computer industry. Well, the problem is that pathogens, in a biological sense, have always been with us. They've been with us for a million years. We co-evolved with them. And we developed immune systems to process them and deal with them. They're very complicated, sometimes simple, sometimes complicated. Viruses are different. This just so happens, this particular virus is a mild respiratory virus that is not a threat to 99.7% of the world's population and is almost exclusively a danger to people over the age of 75 with comorbidities. Average age of death around the world is 82. In the US, it's 79, 78, 79, something like that. The CDC said that only 6% of the people who have died from COVID died only with COVID, only because of COVID. Otherwise, 94% had other problems like heart disease and diabetes and extreme obesity and things that made the immune system malfunction. So this is the reality of this virus, which oddly, we're 9 months into this and hardly anybody even talks about this fact. I mean, it's just actually the most irresponsible amount of journalism, which is another subject I'll get to, but let's just talk about these disease models. So 20 years ago, they started dabbling in this idea of what are we going to do with society when the pathogen comes along? And the idea was to deploy agent-based modeling to somehow prevent its spread. And the way you do that is by having people separate, right? So 6 feet apart, don't gather in large crowds, and then the virus somehow doesn't attach, can't find a host, and then it's never explained what happens to it. The models are very strange in this sense. Another thing that the models do is they all, without exception, presume a homogeneity of risk, right? So that everybody in the population is equally susceptible, which is obviously untrue. Another thing they tend to do is try to predict the amount of death. So these guys really quite had a lot of things going from 2000, the year 2000, other ways to 2005. By the way, as far as I know, none of these early prediction models and these computer models had none of them were trained in the history of pathogens. They'd never had any experience in mitigating a disease. They had never read Cell Biology for Dummies, which you can download from Amazon, which if you haven't, and you're confused by any of this stuff, I'd recommend you do it. They were mostly physicists like Neil Ferguson at the Imperial College, or just a computer modeler like Robert Glass in the United States, or like Harvard's Mark Lipsitch, another one of these early modeling guys, an epidemiologist, but not trained in any kind of medical field. He was trained in this kind of agent-based modeling tradition of disease mitigation and suppression. This is a very different idea from traditional public health epidemiology. And 20 years ago, my favorite philosopher king, as far as I'm concerned, she's the Hayek of infectious diseases. Her name is Sunetra Gupta at Oxford University, wrote an article in which she said, she says that these models, she was panicked about them. She said, these models can serve to obfuscate rather than clarify, or at best add nothing at all to the situation other than to create the illusion of control. And I think that's ultimately what we're dealing with here, is an illusion of control. And in that sense, there's also an analogy there with Hayek's critique of central planning, this illusion of control. It's the same sort of thing. You imagine there's something you can control out there by pulling levers and turning dials, rather than recognizing that human life is a process, and also the way viral pathogens affect the human community is also an evolved process that is international and can't be controlled by, can't be predicted by models, much less controlled by politicians. So early on, we had a problem with the models. Even in January and February, we saw these models coming out that were predicting, making outrageous predictions of death. Again, assuming homogeneous risk on the part of the entire population, presuming previous infection fatality ratios from things like SARS-CoV-1, which vexed the world from 2002 to 2003. They just wrote those into the models and came up with outlandish predictions. So on February 27th, the New York Times predicted that 6.6 million Americans were going to die from SARS-CoV-2. Now, he didn't say what the basis for that prediction was. This was Daniel McNeil, a reporter from the New York Times, degree in rhetoric from Berkeley University in California. He didn't say, except that he said something about this current pathogen reminds him of H1N1 from 1918, reminds him of it, just, reminds him of it. Knowing nothing really about the essential medical characteristics of viruses, this is what he said. And that's what sent the American public into a complete panic. And then the Imperial College got a little more precise and thought that 2.2 million Americans were going to die. Now, each of these models are all very interesting. They're like, if society continues to function as normal, then this is what's going to happen, right? Based on these following assumptions. It took them months, by the way, to even really reveal their models. And it was only after that we realized that they had this assumption of heterogeneity baked into them, and certain implausible assumptions about the infection fatality ratio and so on. But at the time, we didn't know this. And so there was just a lot of panic. And then this whole industry got into play. These people began to come out of the woodwork, interviewed by the press. Oh, you have to lock down, you have to lock down. So when did this idea come along? Well, the idea of locking down in the presence of a pathogen was completely novel. Nothing like this has ever been tried in the history of infectious diseases. It was first proposed, as far as I know, in 2005 at a White House conference called by George W. Bush, who was a bit of an apocalyptic president and invited both medical specialists and computer modelers to the White House to adjust the Center for Disease Control's recommendations in light of what happens in the event of bioterrorism or a new pathogen arriving. And the medical doctors presented evidence which consistent with the advice of the time, which is that you don't do anything to disturb normal social functioning at all. You certainly don't close the schools. Stay-home orders are inconceivable. You don't shut businesses. That's a disaster. It's an attack on civil society. And you don't use quarantines, because those have never worked. And our experience in 1918 showed those didn't work. They only lead to terrible social, cultural, economic destruction. Instead, we need to protect society and get smart, figure out who the vulnerable populations are, and warn them to stay away until the pathogen spreads among the non-vulnerable population, and our human operating systems can upgrade themselves in the presence of the new pathogen, the operating system we call the immune system. And that's how we mitigated disease throughout the whole course of the 20th century, with intelligence and a focus on doctor-patient relationships, and letting the medical community manage it, not politicians. Bush was shown evidence from the other side too, from the agent-based modelers, which he found much more impressive and much more interesting. This is a guy who invaded multiple countries after 9/11, you recall, so he had no problem with this idea of imagining business closures and school closures and creating disaster all around. This is George W. Bush, and he wrote the plans of the modelers into the Center for Disease Control's plans. I had discovered this in 2005. At the time, there was this avian bird flu that everybody got really scared about at the time. It turns out the only living beings that were affected by the bird flu were birds themselves. Then the flu never jumped from birds to human beings, so that was kind of a false alarm. In 2009, the Americans didn't experience this. This is a big deal in Europe, though. The H1N1 came along, and which is the same a version of the same flu that killed so many people in 1918, and Europe went absolutely insane. And so there were flu vaccines that were delivered all over the place. Public health authorities were screaming. There was a widespread panic, and a lot of money was made because governments were allocating billions to disease mitigation. And it turned out to amount to absolutely nothing, or not that much. It turned out to be a mild flu season, the H1N1 2009. So after which, the World Health Organization issued a report that came out in well, there was two reports, one from the World Health Organization in 2000, I think it was 2009, that were blasting what they called the disease industry. That this combination of pharmaceutical companies, hysterical media looking for attention, public health totalitarians whipping up politicians into a frenzy, spending billions of dollars for no reason. They said the World Health Organization said, look, we don't need more disease planning, we need less, because this planning nearly destroyed everything. And then there was a European Council. Sorry, I don't know that much about European politics, but it was a Council of Europe, had a special session, a study group that released a report in 2011 that again attacked this whole industry that was developing around H1N1 of 2009, saying these people are catastrophic. I mean, what they were planning, what they could have done to us, would have abolished all of our rights and liberties and done nothing to mitigate disease. So anyway, that's the kind of background. They were just waiting for a chance. I mean, 15 years of this nonsense. These people, it was very interesting because they became professors at universities, and 15 years is long enough for the professors to have students and for the students to get jobs. They held conferences, they had journals, they met in fancy hotel rooms year after year after year, developing something like an agent-based modeling system of totalitarian control of society. They were never checked. They only spoke to each other. They lived in their own little bubbles, and mostly this intellectual paradigm developed without the assistance of traditional epidemiologists and public health professionals, all of whom were against it. As liberals in this room that are listening, I would highly recommend to you Donald Henderson's great treatise from 2006. And if you just, I don't know how you find it, but just like, it's on AIR's website. If you look up somebody like How Free Society Deals with Pandemics, he wrote a brilliant, he was getting kind of aged at the time. I think he was something like 80 years old at the time, but he wrote a big attack on these agent-based models in 2006 and attacked mandatory masks and travel restrictions and stay-at-home orders and school closures and business closures and restrictions on gatherings. He attacked the whole thing. And at the end of the article said, with wonderful footnotes, Donald Henderson's the guy who eradicated smallpox, by the way. So this is not a shabby guy. And he said the most important thing you can do in the presence of pathogens is maintain normal social functioning. If you follow the plans of these crazy people, you will turn a manageable disease into a social and economic catastrophe. That's what he said in 2016. And everybody said, oh, old man, don't worry about people like that. So this whole industry has been waiting to seize the day. And then, of course, the Wuhan virus, SARS-CoV-2 came along, and it seemed like a perfect opportunity for them to deploy their schemes, their massive social experiment. Now, once the hysteria began to develop, and this is my second point, there's a do something bias that began to develop within the system. We live in a world in which states are supposed to fix every problem, right? No matter what it is. And so there was a do something bias. Well, we have to do something. What should we do? So the politicians began to panic and began to cry out to the modelers, what do you recommend? Well, there was Neil Ferguson, ready to go. There was Carter Meacher in the US. There was Mark Lipsitch from Harvard. Social distancing, targeted layered containment, all the whole apparatus of mandatory masks and target layer containment is another word. Non-pharmaceutical interventions is what they call them. Non-NPIs. The NPIs really, we used to call what we call NPIs and target layer containment. We used to just call the totalitarian state. They were ready to go, and so politicians essentially turned over the apparatus of control of society from the courts and from our legal traditions and from the people and democracy and the legislatures, and took upon themselves power of totalitarian powers of executive rule. That's a do something bias. And I think it's very interesting. I have some sense, I can't prove it, that a lot of these politicians were working off the advice of public health professionals and these disease modelers who imagined that SARS-CoV-2 was going to be very much like SARS-CoV-1. Now, this is a faulty assumption, and here's why. SARS-CoV-1 was actually quite deadly. Like if you contracted it, you stood like a 50% chance of dying from it. It didn't discriminate by age. It was a wicked, wicked disease. What's interesting about SARS-CoV-1, though, is that the World Health Organization often takes credit for having controlled it. But in fact, what you learn from the history of pathogens like this is that very bad viruses die very quickly because they kill their host. And then they can't live to find a new host. And so they burn themselves out really rapidly. Very smart pathogens are mild. They don't kill the host. And therefore, they can transmit further and further and further. They become very widespread. These are smart viruses. SARS-CoV-2 is a smart virus. SARS-CoV-1 is a dumb virus. So what you see in the history of these viruses, especially as they pertain to respiratory illnesses like this, is that there's an inverse relationship between severity and prevalence. The more severe they are, the more quickly they burn themselves out, and the milder they are, the more they spread, and the fewer people they vex and kill. So that inverse relationship was never assumed in any part of the models, and yet that's a persistent trait of all these kinds of respiratory flu-like illnesses. All right, let me get on to my third point, which is a confusion over cause and effect. Let me check my time too. Oh, wow, I've been going on too long. I'm going to have to move really quickly here. But I do, for the question and answer, I do want you to have enough information to ask pointed questions. The third one is a confusion over cause and effect. Now, we experience this in economics all the time, right? So an example of a confusion over cause and effect is this. Like, let's say there's an expansion of the money supply and pressure on the prices, and the prices start to go up. So what do the politicians do? They implement price controls, okay? So what are you doing there? You're trying to control the effect as a way of blotting out the cause. So you're not dealing with the cause, you're only trying to control the effect, trying to game outcomes without any kind of logical consistency. It's the same thing when recessions happen. One of the marks of a recession is the decline in aggregate demand. So you're going to boost government spending to increase aggregate demand to make the recession go away. Okay, that's a fallacy. It's exactly the same thing with these epidemiological models. Here's the way it goes. They observe that when a virus starts to burn itself out, the R naught, which is the transmission rate, very difficult to measure. And again, there's an assumption within the R naught of homogeneity across population groups, which is completely faulty. It's very difficult to know what the transmission rate really is. But once the R naught drops below 1, then the virus begins to burn itself out. That's a sign. It's maybe measurable, probably not, but at least in theory, once the virus begins to go away, the R naught drops below 1. So what you have is all these people, and this is why Europe's locking down again here. They think they can discern what the R naught is, and they see it rising above 1. And so they're like, okay, everybody stay home. Everybody stay out of the movie theaters and out of the bars and restaurants. We're going to drop the infection rate down to less than 1 so that one person won't infect one other person, and we'll slow the spread, if not stop the spread entirely. And then the virus will pack its bags and move back to Wuhan or the Mars or wherever they think it came from, right? So this is, again, a confusion over cause and effect. And I promise you, if you listen carefully to the public health authorities in Germany and Austria and Spain, Italy, and even England and the United States right now, they all talk this way, that they can manipulate the R naught to blot out the actual cause. If we, as intelligent, powerful people, can cause the infection, the transmission rate to decline, then the virus will go away. That's what they're doing, without regard to human rights, human freedom, or everything. That's what they think they're doing. It's all a mistake. It's a confusion of cause and effect. Number 4 is has to do with the fear of the virus, which, I mean, is very primal, I think, in people. People want to get away from viruses. They in the Middle Ages, this is the way they always handled viruses, was to run away from them. In grade school, kids often play a game in which, you know, the girls have cooties or allergy or something like that. You have to get away from them. So people have this desire to get away from pathogens. One of the great ambitions of the 20th century among public health authorities was to moderate that primal sense of fear and help people understand that the worst possible thing you could have is a naive immune system. Getting a pathogen and having your system getting used to it, as vaccines do, or just getting the disease does. If it's mild, that's what you want to do. Then your bodies are protected. Sunetra Gupta says that one of the reasons that we live so long and so prosperous lives in the 20th century is that we were exposed to so many pathogens after World War I, so much immigration, so much travel, that we got stronger and stronger and stronger and lived ever better, longer lives, because we got rid of the naive immune systems that we have and replaced them with very sophisticated, strong immune systems. What lockdowns do is they re-naive us. They take away the intelligence of our immune systems and make us vulnerable to something even much worse, which is what's going on in New Zealand and Australia right now. And that's also why we've had shifting rationales. Remember, initially, at least in the US, the rationale for lockdown was to preserve hospital space. Then it changed just gradually. And then finally, it just ended up being, just suppress and stop the virus, stop the spread, which signs all over New York today say, stop the spread. This is the biggest lie you will ever see. There's no such thing as stopping the spread of a virus like this. It's just crazy. You don't want to do it anyway. This is not Ebola. This is SARS-CoV-2. Finally, there's the public choice element here with the politicians. They want power and they enjoy exercising it. And the media cheers them on. And what they've done with these lockdowns is, I've argued, is create a kind of a new feudalism. dividing the world between essential and unessential workers. You've got the upper class bourgeoisie that can work from home and enjoying their lives on Zoom calls while making the working classes deliver them food to their doors. And you go to the restaurants now, and the bourgeoisie can sit and suck on liquor and eat shrimp cocktail, but the wait staff has to come to you with masks and with rubber gloves, looking like diseased, dirty people. So what we've done is reverse the modern system of equality and democracy and human rights between all people, which we believe in, and created a new caste system, the unclean, who we are forcing to bear the burden of herd immunity. Let them get sick so that we can stay well. That is the underlying ethos, all of which violates what Gupta calls the social contract of infectious diseases. And I'll leave you with this. Her view, and I think it's a correct one, and I've something that she's taught me this year. It's not something I think that libertarians and classical liberals and Austrians need to start thinking about. Pathogens will always be with us. This is not the last one that's come along, certainly not the first one. They've been here for millions of years. We still have to decide to have progress, human rights, equality, democracy, modernity, and live hopeful, long, good lives. And if we try to run away from them, we are living in violation of that social contract, because running away and suppression only forces the voiceless and the powerless to bear the burden of herd immunity for the rest of us. A place like New Zealand, what they did was fundamentally immoral. They said, screw you, the rest of the world, you get sick, we're going to stay all clean and pure. And Australia did something very similar. And every country has done something similar. Make the workers and peasants get out there and do the work for us while we enjoy our lives at home. This is wrong. It's a violation of the social contract. It's contrary to modernity and to all ideas about freedom. So this is a fundamental attack on civilization itself. My argument is that it's rooted in an intellectual error that's gone utterly mad. What are we going to do about it? We need to get smart. We need to learn. We need to read up about the history of infectious diseases, learn about cell biology, study under serious, legitimate public health economists like Martin Kulldorff and Jay Bhattacharya and Sunetra Gupta, all of whom crafted the Great Barrington Declaration, which helped change the debate in the world. And my friends, we have another intellectual battle on our hands. It's not just now against socialism. It's not just against fascism. It's not just against bloody wars that destroy lives. Now it's against the lockdowners. A new enemy has arisen among us, and we must dedicate all of our efforts to stopping them and making sure that nothing like this will ever happen again. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Awesome all your talk, but also obviously frustrating news. Thanks nonetheless for this talk. Again, I can just repeat, we have another 20 minutes. If you have any questions, then you can use the Q&A box here, or my colleague has told me that there's a sizable crowd over at Facebook. So if you have questions, then he will let me know about them. For the moment, I'm the moderator, so I'm arrogant enough and will ask a few questions myself. What I'm just wondering about is that obviously when you look earlier this year during the first round of lockdowns, when you look at Italy back then, or when you look now at countries like France or Belgium, you do have hospitals being overwhelmed by patients. You have sort of intensive care units, sort of a shortage of them at the moment. Like I think from France, you have patients that are sick of coronavirus getting flown over to Germany so that they're getting treated there because there's no capacity anymore in France. Mm-hmm. In these sort of dire situations, isn't there, I mean, it's not really only based on models or something like that, because you can see the actual results in a sense, like in northern Italy in March, where it almost looked like sort of war zones or something like that.
Yeah, it kind of looked like that, and it looked like that a little bit in New York. Once you start to look at it, at the actual specifics of the New York case, there were 2 or 3 hospitals that had about 48 hours worth of problems. But what was amazing is that we had a central plan for the entire. So here's the problem: politicians think they know what hospitals should be used for. So they reserved all the hospitals for coronavirus patients. 350 hospitals throughout the rest of the US had to lay off workers because they weren't allowed to take in people for for elective surgeries or regular cancer screenings or diagnostics. I mean, this country abolished dentistry for 3 months. I mean, it's just unbelievable. So, so the real question is not so much like, what do you do with a virus that has a lot of people getting sick at the same time? The question is like, why are these particular cases, these particular hospital systems unable to scale in the presence of new business, which is, that's how hospitals make money, at least under a capitalist system, is they have patients, right? So ideally, you do want occupancy to be 70, 80, 90, even 100%. I mean, so this is not a bad thing. This means good business for hospitals. But when you're living under a socialist system of healthcare, and where there's no response to supply and demand baked into the system, now you suddenly have extreme limits on supply. And this is what we're really talking about. This is an economic problem, not so much a disease problem. So, here you have a situation where a socialist system of healthcare provision is really coming back to bite us, right? I mean, you don't have this problem in other industries. If you have too many people lining up at your restaurant, you build a second restaurant. I mean, this is, when too many people want to go to the movies, you get a second movie theater, or you open up another screen. I mean, in markets, things scale. But since, for whatever reason, the world has decided that the government should dictate how many hospitals there are, and how many doctors there are, how many nurses there are, and how many people they should be make available. Whenever there's an emergency like this, it can't adapt. So that is a more structural problem. So what we should do in light of this experience is have a free market, actually, in healthcare. And I'm sorry to, no, it sounds like it's changing the subject, because it's actually a really important matter. But you don't want to destroy society, much less, as we did in the United States, ban patients from hospitals and reserve them exclusively for coronavirus patients. That was a real disaster. It's going to create health problems for 2 years hence.
Yeah, that's actually a good point. I remember here in Germany, the discussion right now is that basically we have enough beds in hospitals, but we don't have enough staff. In Austria, we don't have enough beds because nobody really bought any new beds during the summer when everyone was talking about a second wave coming in fall. So there's a lot of confusion about that.
Yeah. It's bad management. It's bad management, and the politicians can't fix it. I mean, that's the thing. When you see a failure on this level, and then you turn it over to the politicians to mitigate, they're only going to make it worse. That's what they specialize in.
Yeah. So the Great Barrington Declaration that the AIER obviously organized, I think is sort of, and correct me if I'm wrong, is sort of proposing that normal life is continuing, but those who would be in danger when they get infected by the coronavirus, like the elderly, they would be sort of protected in a very special way. Is that correct, or would you basically say
it's an okay way to put it? There's nothing. It's not anything unusual about the Great Barrington Declaration. It was basic principles of cell biology and public health. For generations, older people have known that during the flu season, they want to avoid the Justin Bieber concert. You don't want to, in the middle of the flu season, find yourself at the World Series, a game of baseball. You don't want to take unnecessary risks when your immune system is weak. And people have always known this. So the human rationality is capable of solving this problem on its own. So it's not as if the authors of and if you read the Great Barrington Declaration carefully, they never actually advocate any particular government-based policy. What they're suggesting is that we use intelligence to manage the disease with wisdom and clarity about the science behind it. So now an exception might be something like long-term care facilities where people are kind of bedridden. And it's really striking in the US, 80% of the death in Connecticut, in the state of Connecticut, was in long-term care facilities. And I think overall it's been about 40% in the US. I'm not sure what it is in Italy and Germany and Austria, but I'm guessing that this disease has been the same all over the world. The demographics are almost identical. Now, in that case, what you really do want to do is have wise management of a long-term care facility. So for example, you might have to pay the staff an extra wage to stay there during the course of the pandemic. So we can get through the worst of it. Herd immunity can be achieved among the non-vulnerable population, then things can go back to normal. So what we did, I think, it's not clear what we did actually, but we might have just delayed herd immunity among the people who could have handled the disease just fine, either asymptomatic or maybe it's a mild cold or something like that. We delayed that as long as possible, leaving our elderly to die of sadness, loneliness, and despair, which is a huge problem. They can't see their families. It's like, it's so cruel and evil. So that's not what the Great Barrington Declaration is advocating. They're advocating that we get on with the project of herd immunity so we can don't prolong the pain, but deal with it right away so that we can move on with normal life again. And it's even worse in the case of New York. And again, I can't speak to the issue in Italy, but I bet you anything you have similar scandals there. But in New York, they forced long-term care facilities to take in coronavirus patients. So leaving, something like more than 10,000, could be 20 or 30,000 people to die as a result of deliberate exposure. So they did the opposite of focused protection. They did focused transmission, and infection. The people who could handle it least were exposed first. I mean, it was the greatest failure of central planning you can possibly ever imagine. So anyway, this idea of herd immunity, by the way, is it's like everybody should study it and understand it. But when you read about it, don't just go to Wikipedia. What you're going to get there is a pharmaceutical definition of herd immunity. You like consider under ceteris paribus conditions, a new pathogen comes along, and you've got a vaccine. You only need to vaccinate about 70%, and the rest you don't have to. It's a mathematical probability issue. Depending on certain rates of transmission, how many people need to be immune in order for the virus to decline to find any more hosts. Okay, so the typical definition then is 70%, but that does not pertain in real life. There are other sources of immunity other than what you can find in serological tests. There's T cells, there's cross immunities from other diseases. These are real factors. I mean, ask yourself why it is that there are only 7 deaths in Taiwan and something like 30 infections and almost no testing whatsoever, and yet high population densities and no lockdowns at all. I mean, they had far fewer lockdowns than Sweden. They're only bested by Tanzania and Belarus. All right, so. And yet they had no problem. The reason is that back in 2002 and 2003, they had a terrible problem with SARS-CoV-2, SARS-CoV-1. And the cross immunities there have protected the population against SARS-CoV-2. So that's the reason for that. The immune system does work. And so there have been a lot of studies concerning the COVID-19, how many people need to get it and get immune to it in order to create the herd immunity. And the estimates drop as low as 10%. Given T-cell immunity and cross immunities from other diseases, including the common cold, which is a version of coronavirus, and even the flu, we found out in the last week, apparently will also protect you.
Yeah, so considering we know that at least the coronavirus is dangerous, at least to some vulnerable groups, I was wondering, but at the same time, you obviously mentioned that governments basically central planning our entire life is, from a classical perspective, obviously extremely dangerous. I was wondering if you have sort of that interplay between liberty, but also responsibility for your own fellow human beings. Mm-hmm. Is there at least a case to be made that we as private citizens, we as people on the street sort of do care about the virus in a sense, for instance, yes, by wearing masks indoors? No. Or by
no, it's the opposite. You have an obligation. Your obligation is to get out there and live your regular life. You have a moral obligation to your citizens, your fellow citizens, as a non-vulnerable person. And I'm guessing that most everybody watching here is non-vulnerable. If you are hiding from SARS-CoV-2, I'm sorry, you are doing a disservice to humanity and violating the social contract and probably engaged in immoral activity. As far as I'm concerned, you have an obligation to get out there and contribute to herd immunity. That, I would say, that's a moral obligation. So if you're hiding under your bed and think you're doing any favors for anybody, you're not. You're contributing to the creation of a feudal caste system that is causing other people to suffer while you luxuriate in your wealth and your riches and your happy life at home. And I think it's disgusting, and it needs to stop. You need to get out there and take a risk, because your risks will act as a benevolent contribution to getting over this disease. You cannot hide. And the more you hide, the more immoral you are, as far as I'm concerned. So yes, you have an absolute moral obligation. And that moral obligation is to get out there and take a risk and contribute to herd immunity. I believe this fundamentally. And if you don't agree with that, there's something you do not understand about viruses and freedom.
That is not where I thought it would go, but very good. Great. So we have a question from the audience, which is that the way that the mainstream media has sort of tackled this entire issue, do you think, in a sense, there will be a reckoning one day for them as well as the as politicians who have done that? Or will we sort of, I mean, you hinted at it at the beginning of your talk, will there be sort of this situation as we have it today for much, much longer, and people will just get accustomed to it and accept it?
These people have been thoroughly disgusting, using this virus just to get clicks in a 24-hour news cycle, and exploiting people's fears for their own personal profits. And it's been irresponsible and exploitative, and contrary to the way the media has always worked. You know, in 1957-58, the New York Times calmed the public down. In 1968-69, they calmed the public down. Even in 2006, the New York Times was urging everybody to, if you get sick, go see your doctor. That was the fullness of their advice. Somehow in 2020, the media has been fanning the flames of political panic and causing mass Munchausen syndrome and panic and disease fears among the public. And I think it's absolutely grotesque, and there absolutely should be a reckoning. I don't know what that looks like entirely, but I think that the way the media has behaved this year, they deserve to bear and some of the moral culpability along with the political class for this. Yes.
Do you think that politicians will, let's say there's a vaccine or something like that, will they turn around and sort of get back to normal, or will that continue indefinitely? I remember one great article that was published on AIER on Bob Higgs's wretched effect and how many things will continue to stick around, a lot of restrictions. Do you think that will be the case?
They're going to try to stick them around me. I read the statement from the incoming Biden administration. They're going to try to keep the controls on as long as possible. And I think it's really going to come up to people getting educated about the calamity that's happened. I mean, in the United States today, what happened when they closed all the schools is that women quit work and went home to take care of the children. So we have a lower rate of female employment of childbearing age now than we had in 1988. So this is the destruction of a whole generation of women workers. Once these truths come out and we start seeing what's happening with the rise of tuberculosis, because people have not been getting vaccinated for this last year, vaccines are down like 40%. Once we see a full accounting of the amount of despair and suicides and everything else that's been associated here, when we get a good look at the carnage, there better be public anger, and we need to educate people about what happened and the consequences. I mean, look, we are talking about the greatest failure of central planning in our lifetimes, and probably in many, many generations. And if the pro-freedom agenda does not prevail, it's on us. We have a lot of work to do.
That actually is a great segue into one of a question from Jennifer Osborne, who asks what we, as well as the AIER, can do to sort of communicate, educate decision makers on the state level, on federal level, in different countries, to sort of make this message heard. And what is sort of your idea, in a sense, to let liberty prevail again?
Yeah. So the number one obligation is to get educated yourself, right? I mean, this is, I think, Kai, this is a huge problem we've faced as a community since January. We were blindsided by this, and I don't think liberal intellectuals, and we're trained in economics, we're trained in philosophy, we're trained in law, and suddenly all these fancy people talking about, you know, R naughts and TLCs and NPIs, started preaching at us, and we didn't know what to say. We didn't know what to do. It's like, well, a lot of us hadn't really studied this topic, you know? So I think that's the number one obligation, is to actually get busy. Don't be intimidated by the topic. I mean, these epidemiologists, these agent-based modelers, are trampling all over human rights, and they're planning the economy. That's our business. They have entered our sector to tell us what to do. We have to enter their sector and explain where they're wrong. We need to see where Bill Gates is insane. We need to read up on the good epidemiological tradition and public health tradition embodied in the Great Barrington Declaration, and read Donald Henderson's treatise from 2006 and figure this stuff out. Be able to talk about this stuff intelligently, and don't be afraid. I mean, I'm talking like to you today, and I think I try to be as intelligent and smart about this as I possibly can. But the truth is, this lecture that I gave today, I could not have been able to give 9 months ago, because I didn't know a lot of this stuff. So how does it that I know it now? Because I spent a lot of time reading and listening to real experts about it, and opening up my brain and trying to figure it out. And so we all need to do that, and stop being intimidated. I mean, if you care about human liberty, you need to get smart. And as you get smart, don't be scared of the Twitter mob. You know, so what? People gang up on you on Twitter. So what? You know, I mean, a lot of people are not speaking out for career reasons, you know, and for political reasons. It's disgusting. Like, you get some moral courage, get some backbone, get out there and speak, get smart and speak. And I can't guarantee we're going to win the struggle, but we sure as hell aren't going to get any progress as long as people are hiding and quiet and not speaking out about it and saying stupid. Don't be stupid. Get smart and get loud and get aggressive, and let's confront fearlessly the lockdowners on their own territory. Tag them in your tweets. Don't let them get away with this. I know it works. I mean, this guy, Mark Lipsitch from Harvard, you know, he actually debated. It was great. The American Medical Association sponsored a debate between him and Jay Bhattacharya from Stanford, and Bhattacharya just like wiped him out. This is the guy who's been hiding in his Harvard office, never seen a single patient, never cured a single disease, never dealt with any epidemic ever. He's just completely an egghead and living in his off tenure, getting, you know, six-figure incomes. God knows what he's paid, especially with all the pharmaceutical companies that are backing him. So he was shocked to be destroyed by Bhattacharya in a debate, and later that night threw down a few martinis and started hate tweeting all of us, right? And insulting us. And so how do you deal with that? What you do is you come right back at him, and you cite his own work at him, because he had written a paper in 2008 in which he said that social distancing could be a disaster, creating more death among the old, because the longer you delay herd immunity among younger, non-vulnerable populations, the more you force the older population to bear the burden of it. That's what he wrote. So he was hiding from those words. All we had to do is go back to his article, screenshot, and highlight the section and say, what do you have to say now? You know, so he's in shock that because look, this is a guy who's never had opponents, intellectual opponents in his life. And now he realizes there's serious people out there. They're going to hold him to account. That's what we have to do. And I'm sorry, if you're shy to do this, get out of libertarianism, become an Amazon driver, you know, do something else with your life. But if you're going to be an intellectual who claims to love liberty and proclaim to be a liberal, you have to get busy. You have to take risks, and you're going to have to speak out, and you're going to have to face the slings and arrows of the lockdowners. And that's your job. And you have a moral obligation to do it. That's my own view.
I think there really couldn't be a better way to end this than this motivational speech.
Sorry, I sounded a little angry, right? I didn't mean to.
It sounded, you know, very
I used to be a happy guy. I think we've known each other a long time. I remember when I used to be a happy person. I'm still trying to be a happy person, right? But at the same time, now's the time to act. You know, what we've learned is that libertarianism and Austrian economics, this is not a parlor game anymore. You know, we're not here just to go to our fancy conferences and throw down drinks with our friends and gather more likes on Facebook. We have a battle to fight, and if not us, who? It is us. It is up to us. There's nobody else out there doing it. we are in this business because we want a thriving, prosperous, peaceful society. The world is crying out for answers right now. These are the times to engage the battle. We can do this, but we have to get out of our living rooms and off Netflix and get serious and get to work. And I think humanity will thank us in only just a few years. We can win this.
Now you just became optimistic again. Beautiful. um, so that's great. I just posted in the Zoom box. I already posted the Donald Henderson link, and I have just posted some links that our listeners can check out for Jeffrey's work as well as the AIER's. Visit AIER.org. For the Austrian Economics Center page, it's austriancenter.com. And then for those who speak German, we also have the Hayek Institute page, which is hayekinstitut.at. Thanks again, Jeffrey, for being with us or having been with us today. And thanks all of you for joining us today. And let's fight this battle, as Jeffrey just said.
I'm deeply honored that you had me. So thank you very, very much. Let's be in touch.
Thanks.
Okay, all the best.